Bonsoir à tous. Nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue à cette 5e conférence du cycle Frontières de la Maison de l'Architecture. Malgré les conditions sanitaires actuelles, nous avons la chance de pouvoir continuer notre programmation et espérons que vous l'appréciez autant que nous. Ce soir, nous avons le grand plaisir d'accueillir Kjetil Thorsen, cofondateur du bureau Snøhetta. Le bureau norvégien, fondé à Oslo à la fin des années 1980, s'est rapidement fait connaître par des bâtiments hors normes, qui ne ressemblaient à rien de ce qui avait été vu jusqu'alors. Une approche novatrice, une expression unique, dans des environnements eux aussi très particuliers. Leur pavillon d'observation des rennes sauvages notamment, isolé dans une nature brute et aride, a particulièrement frappé les esprits lors de sa réalisation. Un bâtiment très emblématique de l'approche du bureau, dont le nom Snøhetta correspond d'ailleurs à l'un des sommets montagneux de la région. Le choix de présenter le travail de Kjetil et son équipe dans ce cycle nous a semblé approprié, dans la mesure où il se joue constamment des frontières, que ce soit entre la terre et la mer, ou entre le bâtiment et le paysage, les limites sont brouillées. Un jeu qui se développe également entre les géométriques et l'organique, entre l'artificiel et le naturel, ou encore entre l'espace public et l'espace privé. Ils s'expriment enfin dans la forte dimension sociale de leurs projets, qui ne sont pas des monuments statiques, figés, mais au contraire des lieux habités, traversés, interpénétrés par les utilisateurs. C'est à ce voyage que nous vous invitons ce soir, et je passe avec plaisir la parole à Kjetil. Merci, très bonne soirée à vous.
Thank you very, very much. You know, when I first got invited to contribute with a lecture dealing with borders and boundaries and, as we call, thresholds, I was all of a sudden extremely delighted, simply because I started looking at and thinking about how our work could be seen in this perspective. Now, it's not the case that we haven't thought about it before and have discussed these issues, but once when you start diving back into some few projects, which I'm going to show today, and you start seeing and interpreting back, and maybe partially even post-rationalizing on what you think, you discover things that maybe unconsciously has sort of been part of you for a long time. And these kind of borders that are both mental and physical at the same time, all of a sudden start becoming more visual, more understandable within your own work. The Snøhetta team started as a group of friends wanting to change the world as everyone else with landscape architects and architects in a first constellation of things. And the first boundaries that we basically wanted to get rid of were the professional boundaries between landscape architects and architects. We had for a long time been investigating the problem of outdoor space in relationship to buildings. And we had found out, especially in the Nordic countries, that the rest of the money after the building was finished was spent on some trees and some outdoor situations, but never enough for creating really good outdoor spaces. It could be because we had such an amount of nature already belonging to the countries that we come from. However, we established this constellation of people above a beer place in Oslo in 1987, which was the same year as the Brundtland Commission of the UN came out with our Common Future. And this Common Future report is, of course, the background for understanding how the social development, environmental development, and economical development of the world is looking today, and it is also part of the background for the global goals. We started very early looking at the connection of these elements, and I would almost say we based part of the philosophy of the office on this Our Common Future report. So in 1987, as said, Snøhetta established itself in Oslo, and we tried out what we had set out to do, and we were trying out our different professions in different situations in Norway. But we never really succeeded in Norway, so we had to expand and we had to go elsewhere in the world. So for the moment, in fact, we have quite some few locations around the world, One in San Francisco, one in New York. We have in Oslo, obviously. We have in Paris and in Innsbruck. You know, I love skiing. We have in Hong Kong, and we have in Adelaide in Australia. And this group of people keep meeting. Unfortunately, not last year, but we'll try again this year. Keep meeting at the mountain, which is called Snøhetta, and at this wild reindeer pavilion, which you mentioned at the beginning. It's an interesting kind of project for us because it brought us back to some of the roots that we had started off with, but it also brought it into a situation where we could start thinking about these borderlines between culture and between nature. We were in a situation and a location where this building was located exactly on the borderline between a national park and a non-national park situation. This front glass, which you see here, is the division between the national park and the public. Behind, outside this glass, you're actually in the national park, and that national park belongs to the animals of the region. It belongs to the reindeer, it belongs to the oxes, it belongs to the foxes. And in fact, at some point, we were looking at this as the reversal of who is looking at who. All of a sudden, we were collecting people inside this box and they couldn't move freely into this landscape, whereas the animals should come and look at the people inside this box because they were in their right habitat, they were free, and we were locked inside. So this space is trying to promote exactly this kind of division between the interior and exterior as a threshold between two completely different worlds. One completely left in the arms of nature, and the other one very, very humanly organized. You can probably in the back of this picture also see the Snøhetta mountain behind the fireplace. At the very beginning, we had, of course, and this is now since 1989, an issue with how to relate to social sustainability in particular. It became a very difficult process for us to already at the beginning dive into environmental and economical issues. So we decided to focus on the social sustainability of things. And that led us, of course, into the ABC of psychology, affect behavior, and cognition. And that we tried to implement in our own office space. We tried to look at it as a place that actually in itself was a borderline between the free time that you have as an employee and the workspace that we generate for ourselves. As you might know, that in Norway, we're quite strict with working hours, so we keep throwing people out after 5 o'clock. But if you're not inside the office space as a communal group, you can also not defend your position as a singular in the plural aspects of this practice. And that's something we've been following continuously throughout our professional lives, is looking at these thresholds between A and B. And it's given us the possibility, of course, as coastal humans living along the Norwegian coastline, to start reading not only the macro scale of coastline, but the micro scale of the coastline, and understanding that every little jump, every little stone creates another kilometer of coastline and another border to look at. It is quite obvious that the Opera House in Oslo, which was the second large commission that we got after the Library of Alexandria, gave us the possibility of looking exactly at these thresholds once more. If you look at these four diagrams describing the four main elements of the Opera House, or three main elements that then become the Opera House, you will see that at the upper left picture, there is a curved wall. And this curved wall is sitting exactly along the coastline between land and water. And that is also the division between Oslo and the world. And this wall represents the definition of a threshold between the public and the performers in this threshold situation. So you could say the performers are living in Oslo and working in Oslo. So they walk to the right of this curtain to work, to perform for people who are coming from outside and meeting this wall before they go into the performance. So the factory that you see to the right, upper right, is in fact a workspace inside the opera where people go to work from Oslo every day. And that is located on the land side of Oslo. But to the left of that, you have the public areas, the lobbies, and they are over the water. So in that particular location, you have a transition from over the water, through the wall, and onto the land side of Oslo. And that's how the sequence of thresholds were established. And then, of course, we covered the whole thing with a carpet, a roof. And that gave us the possibility of interacting with the larger public with another type of threshold that physically was represented by the building. A sloping roof that was climbing out of the fjord, out of the water, and actually giving us the possibility to have an intersection between the horizontal waterline and the slow climbing up this roof towards the top of the building on top of the opera. That has given us the understanding that architecture might be seen as the art of prepositions. Inside, outside, over, under, between, in front of, behind are all locations of the body. And every threshold that you move through is measured up against the location of your body in relationship to something else. And this roof is symbolizing this way of looking at something you can walk on instead of something you walk into. And all of a sudden, we had a preposition related to opera houses which said you can walk on the opera, not only in the opera. So this roof then all of a sudden was an instrument for us to negotiate between the sky and the waterline itself. And to find this solution, we had to dive deep into the mountains of Carrara and Italy. We had to find a quarry that would actually represent this whiteness and start treating this surface as a negotiator, as a Sunday shirt, but at the same time as something that connected the water with the sky. We had to start testing the surfaces of this marble and move away from the perception of marble being something polished, like a bathroom situation. So the bush hammering surfaces of marble turned out to be wonderful when it comes to catching light, and all of a sudden they became a threshold between light and shadow. We tested these things in one-to-one elements, large scale, with Campolonghi in Italy, and you will even see that these stones that you see here are made out of one piece. There is no joint between the lower portion of the upstep and the upper portion of the upstep of this stone. It is one compact element of stone. And that actually means that there is no transition between horizontal and vertical when it comes to the solidity and massivity of the material itself. It's all made out of one element. So the opera per se actually started moving us in a direction of understanding what we wanted to achieve when it comes to thresholding from inside to outside, from above to below, not only through human movement, but also through the movement of regular understanding of accessibility in a city. In Norway, we have a law which is called the right to roam. That means you can, with a boat or by foot, go to any shoreline along the whole Norwegian coast. Even if it's privately owned, it cannot be fenced in, and you have the right to go there, to sleep there, to lunch there, to be there, to sunbathe there, along the whole Norwegian coastline. And it's an interesting aspect of a transition between land and water, because that means that this threshold belongs to everyone. It cannot be privatized. And we tried to continue this non-privatization of the shoreline situation with the opera house by saying, okay, it is not fenced in. Okay, you can fall into the water, but basically you only get wet. And this public ownership was then initiated and related back to this particular law that talks about the right of roaming. Some of these laws are extremely old, and in relationship to how Norway wrote its constitution, we have a couple of other really strange laws, like you can put up a tent within 500 meters of any building at any point in time and stay there at least 3 days, 3 nights. You can basically, by law, knock on any door and ask to go to the toilet if you wish, and they have to let you in. So these type of things start coming together as something very urban, very social in a sense, simply because it opens up the borderline also between private and public. And the Nordic countries have been looking at privatization and non-privatization in gray zones, half private, semi-private, semi-public, and so forth. And these gray zones start getting extremely interesting when we talk about architecture. So the public ownership of this roof of the opera all of a sudden became more than a threshold between the building from the fjord to the sky, more than the threshold between the public and the employees of the opera. It also became a threshold between the public and the private understanding and public ownership. If you can sit on something, you can own it. If you go to a restaurant and you sit on a chair while you're having dinner, that chair is your chair. When you leave the restaurant afterwards, that chair goes back to the restaurant and the restaurant belongs to it, and is in the belonging of the restaurant. These are the type of things. But the opera is also the threshold between the collective or the plural and the singular. And in this transition between, say, being on your own and being together with others, there is this huge span of trying to find your own position in the world. And I don't want to emphasize that architecture is a tool that can deal with all of these things, but it can provide you with some possibilities of self-acknowledgement. It can provide you with the visualization of ideas that you're already carrying with you. And by doing it, all of a sudden you find out what you were thinking of the day before. It's a little like when you hear a strange word for the first time. During the next week, you will hear it 100 times. And this consciousness of relationship between how things are when you're on your own or when you're together with the public is extremely important. And this starts from the very beginning. This kind of on your own or collectiveness is part of how we build the relationship between us and the objects that we create for ourselves. And of course, at the end, the opera house is the threshold between a built environment and the sky. It is, per definition, the horizon. And simply through the architectural solution with the ha-ha, of course, there are no barriers between the top surface of this roof and the sky. It brings you as the one kind of element on top of everything with a free view surrounding the building. So as a total, it is also a threshold or a boundary line or a border between the different seasons. Now, how does a building react to the winter compared to the summer? What kind of activities all of a sudden start opening up when you look at the transition of a building within the different times of year? Now, positively speaking, the building then becomes part of nature because it reacts as if it was part of nature in relationship to the activities you can deal with. And the short bridges and the narrow bridges that are thresholds from the land side onto the opera, the threshold that squeezes you low before you enter the building and then reopens the lobby into the height and into the different situations as you move further and deeper into the building. And all of a sudden, you are caught by the movement from the lobby through the solidity of a wooden wall, up the stairs, back to the view out to the fjord and into the performance area. And that performance area is also a kind of boundary between the public and the actors. The light that you introduce is part of that. How do you set the vertical limitation of a space, like here with the chandelier, down to the smallest detail? Or what is the boundary line of the stage curtain, here by the artist Pay White? So I think we have to be very clear about the fact that everything we're dealing with is dealing with in front of and behind of, over or under. And this stage curtain gives us a clear possibility to reinterpret what you discover once that curtain is gone. And in this particular case, everyone thinks it is made out of silver threads, but basically there is no silver in this at all, and it's not three-dimensional, it's flat, because once it's gone, it promotes a totally different experience. And that opens up the back side of the building towards the front of house side of the building. And the threshold, the curtain, the boundary is gone. That, of course, also counts for the back of house functions and the workshops. Like I said at the beginning, the factory that is located in Oslo provides a normal everyday situation for all the 800 people working in the opera house, and to provide a nice workspace for them that are actually creating the stage sets is another threshold, not unsimilar to the kind of setup and split of day that we have in our own office when we do architecture. So to summarize, these kind of things are things that you think of, and we've been writing about these things also during the competition. They were themes that we were thinking of when the building becomes, let's say, when the building becomes the translator of all these things that you're thinking. And then the question is, of course, do you actually connect the building with these type of things when you're there, or do you not? We don't really care. You might as well just sit on the roof and remember that you forgot to buy milk for your home, and that's the only thought you had. So you don't have to deep dive into associative thinking in order for you to transfer yourself into a borderline situation. Now, another one, which has been published quite a bit lately, but much smaller and of a different kind, is a small restaurant which is called Under. We were given the task by two brothers on the southwest coast of Norway to see if it would be possible to design a restaurant that would be an underwater restaurant. And you can imagine at the beginning of such a job and the sort of Caribbean feeling that you might want to have for an underwater restaurant with clear glass and everything is glass and you're sort of sitting in a bubble underwater. But of course, that wasn't part of our interest. We were not interested in the Caribbean kind of transition from above to below. We were interested in a much harder and more direct relationship between an object and the water. So again, the building became a crossover. This oblique kind of transition from above water to below water became the driving force of this. And also the movement from above water to underwater became an important part of the interior solution and how the building actually started performing. And again, you will see that these details that actually deal with exactly this fine moving line between water and land is so attractive. It's one of these hypnotizing elements and time frames that you move into, and you can stare at this situation for hours, mainly related to the way of longing for something else. You know, the borderline of between water and land is the place where you can either leave or stay. And it gives you a position of understanding what you want to do with your life. It is life-changing when you move into these situations. The section of the building is simple. You don't really see everything above water and how it's actually constructed, but it was precast on a floating deck, then transported floating to the site, lifted off the deck, then carefully sunk into the water, and then filled with water, so it would sink all the way down to the foundation points, and then it would be fixed by the foundation, and all of a sudden, whips, after having pumped the water out, you had underwater space. And when you again walk over this tiny bridge to enter the building, it's almost like the building is already left land and is more like a vessel than a building. But once you come inside, it's clearly a building. You meet a normal bench. It's not marine. It is an interior space clad with wood as any other building. And as the interior space opens up, all of a sudden, you understand that there is a different thing awaiting you at the bottom. So the light coming through this big window at the end, which is 6 meters underwater, all of a sudden is your great attractor. On the way down, you can measure how deep you are underwater by another vertical window, which shows the borderline between air and water in the middle of the window. So you understand and you have a reference system as you move further down towards the bottom of the restaurant where you're sitting and looking where you're being served. So even the chairs and even the furniture, the tables we designed, and they are also this transition of movement as one-liners, where the leg of the chair starts on the floor, moves above the seat, then goes down below the seat, then goes above the seat and becomes the seat back, and repeats itself on the other side. So even the chair is an undulating element of below and above as one line. And these type of things we play with. Another transition here, of course, is then again the one between the chef and the public, the diners of the restaurant. When you look back into the kitchen, and at the same time, you know that your chef who's making the meal has just been in the water, collecting all the things that you're going to eat. Then you understand that the food that you're getting on your table also represents something else from a different element than the one you're sitting in. And all of a sudden, the representation of these plates, this food that you're actually eating, the way it's presented and how you sort of get in touch with all of this gives you the understanding that your location in the world is now definitely different than it was before lunch or before dinner. And I think this is the interesting aspect of trying to translate architecture into more than just an element that provides you with exactly the normal way of thinking or the normal expectation of functions. Because also in this particular situation where you have this big window in front of you, you have the possibility of creating another function inside this restaurant, which is another transition, borderline, threshold. So the restaurant is not only a restaurant, it's also a marine biological research center. And this window looking out at the ocean under the water gives us the possibility not only to count the number of lobster larvae in a cubic meter of water, but it also gives us the possibility to discover new species of jellyfish, like we have discovered 2 more, the behavior of small animals along the coastline, and to study them very differently from a moving camera or from a moving diver. We have the ideal fixed platform because along the coastline, approximately 100 meters out into the water, is the best measurement to see how climate is changing the biodiversity of this earth. That's the best book to read if you want to look at these things. You look along the coastline of countries and you see how things drive the change and how climate actually does influence. So as a total, this kind of hybrid building between a restaurant local sourced food and biological research center, all of a sudden we saw the opportunity of saying architecture could be more than it seems or more than it looks, but you have to decide for it to be that way. Another project which is dealing with maybe slightly different kind of borderline perspectives is our project for the Lascaux caves close to Montignac in France. The Lascaux caves are, as you might know, about 30,000-year-old caves with cave paintings. And this visitor center, as you can see here, all the way in the back, is basically only a cut in a landscape, and then we've lifted the landscape carefully up to walk under it into another experience for the caves. Now, maybe at this point, it's also important to say that the location of the building itself was important, because the building is sitting exactly on the borderline between forest and agricultural land. And exactly along this borderline, we follow the cut of the building, and that's where we raise the ground. So you will see that clearly here in this kind of raised platform situation, where the front cut is following the borderline between the forest and the agricultural land. That gave us the possibility, again, to reinterpret what is inside the mountain or under the ground and what is outside the ground. And how do you bring the public inside and outside and over at the same time? Simply by following the shape of the landscape, the topography, and the topography gave us the climbing aspect of the public walking over the roof and back down again on the other side, which by coincidence also follows the solar movement from east in the morning until west at night. So that means that the entrance facade of this building is always in shadow. So when you come to the inside through this entrance, the first thing you see is a small lobby, but then you enter a lift and you come up to the roof of this element after you've entered in through what we call the big slot. And this slot provides you again with natural daylight. And after you've entered from here into the lift to the roof, you start walking outside of the museum again, back into the cave and the reconstruction of the caves that we're seeing. So slowly, you're going from the roof, climbing down into what is a copy of the cave. This is an enormous achievement because the projection of all the paintings on the wall with the materials, with the color, has been dealt with, and it took more than 2.5 years for almost 20 craftsmen to actually redo this. But that leads us to another interesting threshold between contemporary, between copy, and original. Now, where is the borderline in trying to achieve an experience that is supposed to give you the context of something real that is 30,000 years old, but by copy? And especially in a case where the cave itself had to be closed for any type of public visits. Simply by breathing inside the original caves, you would ruin the surface of the cave inside. So all these paintings are redone, are contemporary pieces of art, but as true replicas of the cave itself. Just as a funny note, to see that the borders weren't always the same, we found images of reindeer inside the caves of Lascaux, which are the same family as the reindeer now at Snøhetta and Dover. Of course, they follow the ice and the edge and the boundary of the ice, and direction north. So all of a sudden, the edge was an attractor. for the reindeer to move from south to north. And of course, this boundary line and this threshold between history, the past, the copy and the original cannot stay commented. So the first thing that happens when you come out of the cave is you come into an exhibition space which shows you how these artificial caves have been built. They show you that you've been through a contemporary piece of art and not a historical copy. And this sense of understanding is extremely important for people to not be conceived or for not to be tricked into another atmosphere or into another kind of understanding than the real one. And that's why we decided to decipher the whole construction of these elements in the exhibition as you come in afterwards. Then, of course, again, after you visited this kind of deciphering of how the elements have been built, you come out again. And then you have the blue sky, you have a water fountain running down the wall. And from this particular point of view, again, the museum has become an inside-outside experience through time, through history, revealing history, going back, revealing contemporaneous, and then moving out again, before you come back in to this core situation. And then, only then, you can start moving into the other parts of the exhibition. I think it is important when we look at these things to understand that even though we think it's a conscious choice sometimes, what we do, to rely on what we call collective intuition. And that might seem like something that is impossible to achieve. How can you, on one hand, have intuition which is related to the life of one person normally, and turn that into something collective? And I think the basis for that is the cultural background we're coming from. That is when similar pictures are being generated in minds of people who come from a similar kind of education or similar background. But they can only be challenged when you start seeing pictures and physical embodiment of objects like the Lascaux Cave Museum. So you will see very clearly here that already in shape and in form, the underground elements of this building are to a large extent overcoming whatever you see. The building is much, much bigger than what you experience. And at the same time, it's laying there as one of these deers jumping over a certain terrain. And you don't see it and you don't notice, but it's there. Now, I'm going to end, and I'm not sure how long I've been talking, but the last one I'm going to show is quite a different project again. And to me, extremely important because it's influencing so many people in their daily experience of how a city can be perceived. It is the Times Square in New York, stretching from 42nd Street to 47th Street, turned into a pedestrian area. Now, the grid system of New York is of specific interest, of course, but this diagonal stretch and the cross has a very particular meaning in the transition from a regular grid system to a diagonal in New York. And that in itself, this diagonal and the way it crosses through New York, Broadway, is of course one of the things that makes you wonder, why did they need this diagonal? It is a willing diagonal. And I believe that all borderlines need a reference system. If you don't have a reference to the grid system, you will only experience the grid system as an ignorant. But once you introduce the diagonal, which here in this case, again, if you look at this as a possible section, is the Opera House. And all of a sudden, it's cutting through things in a totally different manner. This time, however, in plan. So the task was to transform a place which had been preoccupied by cars for such a long time that people had forgotten the proportions of this space. They had forgotten about the diagonal, The place was not used by New Yorkers, it was used by tourists. And at the same time, it became the transition zone for new infrastructure in New York. Everything that you don't see, which is here underground, providing new electricity lines, computer cabling, connection lines, water, drainage, the whole infrastructure is below this new plaza. So it's also the borderline between the services of a city that you don't see and the service of a city that you actually walk on. At the same time, building and constructing this was of course strange because it had to be shut off. And the idea of shutting off this street and hoping that the traffic would still go okay in New York was a big assumption, because nobody did any type of research before we actually turned this into a pedestrian area and closed it down. So the cars just had to find their own way. There were no changes made to the city grid. There were no projections of how the cars should move in the future. That Times Square stretch from 42nd to 47th Street was just closed down. And the cars, of course they found a way, because cars react like water. They find a way if they can drive and roll the wheels over it. So this new floor that we then established on Times Square is covering up all of this superstructure and infrastructure that is following the city grid of New York along a diagonal. And even in the layout of the stone, you will see that the transition between the two grid systems is existing. So even in a micro perspective, this way of moving from one position to another, you could say in an oblique manner, is present. At the same time, the floor here had to connect to hundreds of different floor heights at street level, from shops and restaurants and everything connected. So it's become also the great connector. So right now there are no steps almost into any of the stores and any of the functions surrounding Times Square. So the floor is sort of lifting itself carefully and connecting all the different levels around Times Square, so you can roll in with wheelchair wherever you want to without any steps. And that was then somehow the great connector between all these individual pieces, and it became an extremely important positioning of how Times Square could return to a place that New Yorkers would come back to. And we did find out during these situations when we were starting these things that, yes, New York wants this place, it needs this place, because you could populate a place in New York along a diagonal where you had never been able to place your eye, with the exception of inside a car. All of a sudden you could stand still in the middle of the road. You could look at different things. You would see a city again in a different way. And all the elements of the city would be prepared for you in a slightly different manner. And by doing that, we created new perceptions of Times Square. We gave it another perspective. We gave it new functions. We introduced benches, which actually meant that you could sit and wait. You didn't have to speed across Times Square again, so you could locate your body, rest, sit, be in these places. And for any type of kind of use or eye point of view, we would have provided the citizens of New York with a possible new kind of standout. And of course, these type of things never go completely uncommented. And this is part of the problem we have with architecture, is explaining the real content. Again, back to the very beginning when I said the ABC of psychology. What is it that triggers so many feelings, so many notions, so many non-appropriate appropriate ways of discussing and dealing with our physical surroundings? Why are there so many dislikes in this? And I can assure you that if you have a man like de Blasio, after this, because of some half-naked women on Times Square wanting to dig the whole thing up again, then you've lost. And we should rely on these small moments where people take advantage, take ownership to the place where they are, the different possible uses of things, and then finally, at the end of all this, celebrate wherever you are with whoever you're friends with. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kjetil. Thanks a lot. Very interesting presentation. We travel all over these different borders and thresholds. We are now at the time of the questions, so I'm waiting for some questions, and I have one or two already prepared for you. The first one is a very plain question that struck me when you presented the opera. I was wondering, have you considered using a local stone for the opera instead of Carrara marble?
It was a big discussion, in fact. I was sitting in television programs where I was accused by local politicians for wanting to buy Italian stone only and not looking at Norwegian stone. But the fact of the matter is we wanted a very dense marble, which means that when it rains on it, it's still white. And you know the porosity of marble is so dense that whatever weather you have, it's still white. There's another thing with the marble, and you don't find that in that type of marble in Norway, is that it's an unfinished stone. So when you hit the marble with something hard, it goes bling, because the tension in the marble has music. And if you do the same with the granite, and the granite might be whitish, it goes blump. There is no tension. It's a finished stone. So we wanted a stone with music, a stone that was white also on a rainy day, and we wanted something that was historically also connected to opera as an art form. So we won that battle.
Thanks.
And also Norway is exporting a lot of stone. What would happen, to the Norwegian stone industry, which export completely black stone, for instance, to Italy, if we told them in Italy, no, we are only going to use our local stone, you are not able to bid? I think we would have been in a different situation.
Thank you. Another question, we were talking about climate during the presentation. How do you confront your projects as you are building all over the world with the different climates, which are very far from each other? I'm thinking about Egypt compared to the Norwegian mountains. Do you go with protection or merging or dialogue between the building and the climate?
Yeah, I mean, we did very early say that there is a certain relationship between form and environment. You could even say form follows environment to some extent. But when you become active on the environmental side and the climatic side, you also have to produce clean and renewable energies. For instance, you have to reduce the consumption, but you also have to look at the embodied energy in the materials that you're using. So for us, the less you actually deal with transforming a material from being one thing to another thing, the better it is. If you can take a material directly and use it directly, it always has a better CO2 footprint. But the context is driven also not only by the movement of the sun, the wind, the temperature, but it's driven also by the performance of the building when it comes to producing energy. So if our powerhouses for the moment, which are CO2 neutral buildings calculated over a period of 60 years, including all materials transport, consumption of energy during lifespan, and recycling of all the materials, the CO2 equivalents start becoming part of the calculation, where you have to look at not only the sort of local heritage, that is directly related to the place where you are, but you also have to use your basic knowledge in how to produce clean, renewable energy more than what you consume. And this varies, of course, depending on the sun path and depending on where you are in the world. But one good thing about the world is that every place on Earth has the same amount of daylight during the year. It's just distributed very differently.
Thanks. We have a question from Michael on YouTube, which is similar, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The environment is a real concern for us in Europe, much less for other developing countries. How do you manage to bring your ideas and convictions when you build a project in countries where it is much less important?
Well, I think this is a hard question to answer in a proper manner. But you have to remember that some of these developing places where climate matters less are the least consumers of are the smallest consumers of renewable energies. Their life standard is totally different. So some of these people where we say, okay, they don't care about the climate, are the people that don't really contribute to the pollution. We have to start at home. We have to start in Europe. And we have to take the lead and we have to show how it goes. Also when it comes to how people perceive their own comfort, their liveliness, their everyday working capacity, their way of having a real personal comfort. So I'm a little opposed to this question because I've heard it so many times. What are you doing in countries that don't care? Well, these countries are in fact the countries contributing the least to the pollution.
Thank you. We have a question from Anna on Facebook who asks, what is your consideration of biomimetism? I don't know if I say it correctly. In architecture, is it a naturalist approach or do you have another consideration?
Well, if she's talking about mimicking kind of biological forms or shapes, I would say that to me is a too formal kind of approach. My interest in nature is coming out of what I talked about earlier when it comes to prepositions. Where is the body located in relationship to something is interesting. And in nature, we have all prepositions in the language belonging to that nature. In, over, in front of, behind, in the forest, on the water. So we have these prepositions, and I'm more interested in the relationship between surroundings and the body than I am in the form of that nature or that natural element. Although we have sometimes used it when we find that it is suitable for that particular condition or that particular climate.
Thank you. One question from Laurence. With the new challenge of anti-terrorism security in construction, how to build a building like the world headquarters, how to make it safe and open to the public, like in your projects?
Well, it depends on the people you work for and the clients you have. Let me tell you a story. I mean, just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, we were invited by Le Monde to present our project for the new headquarters of Le Monde in Paris. And I was in a meeting with Pierre Berger, who was then part owner of Le Monde at the time. And some of the employees of Charlie Hebdo were actually working out of the Le Monde offices at the time because their own offices had been closed down due to the attack. And during that meeting, Dreyfus, who's the managing director of Le Monde, and Pierre Berger both said, we know what happened only 3 days ago, but we still want an open, accessible media house in the middle of Paris. And to me, that is the reaction. After the attack on the socialist youth camp on the island outside of Oslo in Norway, also our prime minister said, we will not necessarily increase our public awareness of how to secure our cities, because then we will not isolate ourselves, because then the terrorists have won. We want to maintain the openness and the connection that creates social life in our urban settings and make sure that this is kept for a longer period of time. And the same Pierre Berger said during that meeting. And now the Le Monde headquarters in Paris are, it's finished. They moved into the building, and it's a media house that you can walk through on ground level under a big arch which connects two sides of the site. There is a public entrance into performing areas in the media house, and there is an entrance for the employees that make it possible for them to walk straight to their work desk. But I think it's all about the attitude of the people that actually employ you to do these things. And we have to keep fighting for accessibility, openness in our products, in how the city looks, in what it is, in parks, in buildings. And we shouldn't be so afraid of opening up things slightly more between inside and outside. Don't forget that in the Western world, we're spending approximately 90% of our lives indoor. 90%. I think approximately 14% of these 90 is in the toilet. What do we want to achieve is to reduce this 90%, say, with 1% down to 89. That would be a massive achievement in the Western world. And that's why you have to blur these borderlines between inside and outside and look at them as one public space. Not so unlike some of the Nolli plans from Rome, as you might know, because they actually do not deviate between indoor and outdoor. They only show the difference between publicly accessible and not publicly accessible. So you can read a city like a Nolli plan, and you can provide indoor and outdoor at the same level of accessibility.
Thank you. We have a question from Chris on YouTube about sustainability and future. What about using more wooden construction than concrete?
Absolutely. And wood is becoming more and more very relevant, even for high-rise buildings. And we've done a lot of wooden projects ourselves, and we believe very strongly in that. But remember that for every cubic meter of wood that you're using in a construction, you have to plant 3 new trees. And the cubic that you're actually relating to when you think of wood as a sustainable material is only because it's replaceable with something new that grows. And if you don't do that, it at some point is no longer sustainable. Of course, it is a much more sustainable material than today's concrete, no question. But I do believe that in the future there will also be environmentally CO2 neutral concrete production lines. And we are experimenting with some few of them for the moment, but we are not there yet. But I do still believe that concrete is a great building material. And I would feel very badly if we did not solve this issue and this problem with the CO2 neutral concrete. But wood is beautiful. We love wood. We come from Norway. We use wood. Our first wooden building was even a museum for not structurally, but cladding and other minor structures for the Winter Olympics in Lillehammer in 1993. At that time, nobody liked wood because it was a domestic material. In 93, people were saying, you can't clad a museum in wood. You cannot use wood in the interiors. You cannot use this. It's domestic material. We said, no, it's not. It's public.
Thanks. Another question. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges of the zero emission hotel on the Arctic Circle?
Svart, yes. Well, that is full of challenges, I have to say. But the basic intention and the concept is to create a powerhouse hotel, which is completely offline, self-sufficient, and dealing with all the systems that you might think of when you come there. Yeah, from waste to energy, cutting off the main road so you can only come there by electrical boat, reducing the number of tourists in and out, making sure that all the materials have been reproduced and can be calculated on CO2. Energy production is clean, collecting everything that is possible within today's world into one system. And we believe that that building, if we do it correctly, also could contribute to possibilities of tourism, which are not only about sort of creating sustainable buildings, but also about sustainable numbers of visitors and controlled visitors. And not necessarily by increasing the sum of money you have to pay to go there, but you have to wait in line. So if it's full, it's full. And at that point in time, you'll have to wait a year or 2 years or 3 years to be able to go. So not to make it more expensive, but to make it less available. And when it's made less available, you have to also ensure that it is a game of CO2 neutrality, and in this particular case, calculated over a period of about 45 years.
Thank you. And I have one last question from Fanny. Your projects seem so futuristic some of the times. What is the next border for Snøhetta? Are there any projects that you would not engage in?
Yeah, we say no to a lot of projects. We've said no to airports. We are saying no to military installations or military kind of interventions wherever we go. And in certain countries, we are only saying yes to academic or cultural work, because we believe it needs to spearhead kind of the development of society. I'm not sure if they are futuristic. I find them totally down to earth and sort of everyday kind of pieces of architecture. I mean, maybe they look a little futuristic, but in effect, they're totally straightforward. So I'm not sure if they really are futuristic. Maybe they are, not really. At least I don't feel they are.
Many thanks, Kjetil. Thank you all. Merci à tous d'avoir suivi cette conférence, en espérant qu'elle vous ait plu. La prochaine conférence est la conférence de Christian Lutz le 20 mai 2021. Kjetil, once again, thank you very much. We hope to see you in Geneva when time allows. Merci à tous. Très bonne soirée.
I would love to come. Thank you very much.